I always knew that I wasn't born to spend my life in a stuffy office or grow bored in a quiet suburban setting. From a very young age, I felt an irresistible pull toward the sound of wind rustling through treetops and the musty scent of forest soil after rain. My mother constantly fretted over me when I ran away from home to immerse myself in the endless world of sprawling oaks and maples. My father never understood why his son wasted time wandering instead of studying diligently, but I simply couldn't be held back. Every trail and every clearing became a new discovery, a remedy against routine and anxiety. As a child, while poring over old photos of rangers in books about national parks, I imagined myself wearing a uniform and patrolling wild lands, protecting nature from careless tourists and poachers. My parents hinted that loving the forest was wonderful, yet when it came to a career, I should choose something more serious. They wanted to see me become a lawyer or a doctor with a steady income and prestige. Meanwhile, I secretly worked part-time at a local nature reserve, maintaining trails and helping with wildlife studies, feeling like a part of something important. Every time I returned, a deep sense of satisfaction filled me. I was living my dream. Over the years, the pressure from my family only grew. In high school, my father gave me a choice: pursue law or medicine. He considered the forest nothing more than a hobby, an immature amusement that would never lead to success. I remember standing in the living room before my parents, surrounded by walls lined with diplomas, as I announced in a trembling voice that I refused to follow in their footsteps. As if to back up my words, I showed them a catalog for a ranger training program, but my parents merely sighed in response. My mother couldn't understand why I stubbornly pursued what she saw as a dangerous, and in her opinion, low-paying job. Eventually, tired of fruitless persuasion, I left home. I packed a backpack with a few modest belongings and a small sum saved from years of odd jobs. No one saw me off, except my best friend Chris, who waited at the gate. He knew my dreams better than anyone else and always supported me. In his expression, I saw empathy. We were both seekers of our own happiness, unburdened by others' expectations. I couldn't leave, though, because there were no nature conservation jobs available. I subsisted on temporary gigs, working on construction sites, in auto repair shops, even delivering mail. Yet, deep down, I never lost hope. Every time I read news about national parks, I pictured myself among majestic mountains and ancient trees, hearing the echo of my own heart calling me forward. And still, despite the hardships, I refused to abandon my childhood dream, to become a ranger, to be part of an unexplored world where nature reigned and made a person feel truly alive. After long months of unsuccessful job searches, I was on the brink of despair. My funds were dwindling, and the prospect of becoming a ranger was gradually turning into a distant, unattainable dream. I moved in with Chris. He took pity on me and let me stay in his tiny suburban apartment. We cramped into one room, where my bed was nothing more than a fold-out in the corner and a shelf laden with books, featuring the faces of politicians and historical figures, hung above my head. Chris was fascinated by history, but I cared for nothing else except nature. While endless volumes on military campaigns captivated his imagination, I remained drawn solely to the wild beyond the city. Every evening I scoured the internet for job openings, but the positions I dreamed of were almost non-existent. The few postings that appeared were filled immediately, leaving me no chance. I had to take whatever work I could get. Most often, I was hired to clean yards and mow lawns, a typical job for transient, temporary laborers. I felt no shame in honest work, but with each passing day, A growing anxiety nagged at me. What if my parents' prophecies about the futility of my path proved true? One day, while browsing websites, I stumbled upon a short notice. Ranger needed for the Appalachian National Forest. No experience required, internship possible. It almost seemed like a prank. Even the location was mentioned only in passing. North Carolina, registration in Asheville. I couldn't believe it was that simple. But almost on impulse, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number. A gravelly voice answered, identifying himself as Richard, the station chief. He immediately got down to business without any greeting. I answered questions about my education, experience, and motivations. Surprisingly, he liked my eagerness. "Do you really want to work in the forest?" he suddenly asked. I wanted to answer, but I realized not a trace of doubt had crept into my voice. I told him about my passion for nature, and he seemed to listen half-heartedly. Then Richard interrupted me. "Can you drive a manual? And shoot a rifle?" I faltered, but admitted that I had basic skills. Suddenly, the silence on the other end grew tense. "Answer me one last question," Richard said. "Are you afraid of what roams the forest at night?" I didn't know what to say. Perhaps it was a local joke, or a test of nerves. Almost automatically, I replied that I'd seen wild animals, and they didn't scare me. There was a creak on the line, then a brief "all right," followed by a long tone ending the call. I sat staring at the phone for several hours until I finally received a call back. "You can come in," Richard said. "We'll send you a paper with details and the terms of employment. The interview is over." The line went dead, and I remained in silence for another 30 seconds. It was my salvation. Even though I didn't fully understand what Richard meant by mentioning nocturnal fears, I could hardly refuse. I excitedly ran to Chris with the news. Thoughts swirled inside me. What if this was just an ordinary ranger post? Yet the memory of Richard's voice brought with it a strange unease. Still, I chose not to overthink it. The main thing was that I had a chance. Essentially, it was my last hope. When I received an official envelope from the Appalachian Forest Service in the mail, my heart pounded so hard it seemed like it might burst from my chest. Inside were a plane ticket to Charlotte Douglas Airport and several sheets of instructions. Essentially, I had already been accepted. No tests or assessments, just a brief outline of what lay ahead and emergency contact numbers. The strange question from Richard about what roams at night resurfaced in my mind, but I didn't let myself be discouraged. Perhaps it was merely a local tall tale to scare newcomers. Departure day arrived without notice. Chris helped me pack my things, and I boarded a bus heading to the nearest airport. Doubts gnawed at me. My parents were sure I was making a mistake. Yet the thought of majestic mountains, roaring rivers, and pristine forests renewed my resolve. I clutched the envelope with the tickets, as if afraid it might all be nothing more than a dream. The journey took almost the entire day. When I finally set foot on the grounds of Charlotte Douglas Airport, a festive feeling overwhelmed me. The vast building, bright lights, and bustling crowds were a stark contrast to my humble life with Chris. I was especially pleased that I would soon be venturing deep into the state, far from the noise of metropolises. I found a man holding a sign that read, "Alex Ranger Service." It turned out to be Sam, a reserved-looking young man with an impenetrable gaze. He spoke very little, simply saying, "Let's go," as he headed to the vehicle. The Ranger Service's SUV was noticeably worn out, with peeling paint and torn seats. When Sam started the engine, a crackling sound came from the radio. I barely managed to catch snippets of conversation before he turned it off, giving me a disapproving look. I didn't ask any questions, feeling that chatter was unwelcome here. We drove for hours, navigating dangerous mountain switchbacks. To the left, pines and oaks towered. To the right, bottomless chasms unfolded. There were hardly any signs pointing to populated areas, only the occasional sign leading to campgrounds long deserted in the off-season. Sam drove in silence, intently watching the road. Sometimes it seemed as if he was listening for something unseen. Finally, we stopped at an unremarkable roadside diner where Jessica, a cheerful member of the ranger team, waited for us. She briefly pulled me aside, explaining the local routes and weather conditions. Her friendliness was a pleasant contrast to the sullen Sam. As we set off again, the sun had slipped behind the mountains, and the forest was enveloped in chilly twilight. The last stretch of the journey seemed endless. We ventured deeper until we emerged onto a narrow dirt road. Moonlight broke through the tall trees in patches, and at one point it appeared that something was moving in the depths of the thicket alongside us. Suddenly, an inexplicable fear washed over me, as if the forest itself were watching us. Eventually, we arrived at a solitary guard tower perched on a lonely hill. When I got out of the car, my heart tightened with both exhilaration and anxiety. This was what dreams looked like in real life. I hadn't yet realized that I had stepped onto a path leading to trials that would turn my life upside down. As soon as I stepped inside the tower, I was overcome by a strange sense of detachment from the familiar world. Wooden plank walls, a narrow staircase to the upper level, and windows on all four sides made it resemble a true outpost in the wild. In the small foyer, I noticed a bookshelf, a map, and an old lantern. Dim light fell on the dusty floor marked with heavy boot prints. When I ascended to the second level, I found a simple cot, a table, and a radio, everything needed for a solitary post. Nothing hinted at danger. Later, Sam arrived. He handed me some papers outlining the daily schedule, and then unexpectedly said that I would have to work here alone. I was surprised. I had always thought that at such posts at least 2 rangers were on duty. Without meeting my eyes, Sam explained that it was the rule. At our stations, everyone works solo shifts. Then he left, citing an urgent call. His reaction slightly alarmed me, but I decided it was just local protocol. After unpacking my things, I decided to explore the tower. In a corner on the floor lay a tattered notebook with a faded cover. In bold black letters, it read, "The 5 most important rules." Intrigued, I opened it. The pages were scribbled in hasty, jagged handwriting, with stains that looked as if they were from moisture or blood. I carefully read the text and saw a series of brief warnings. 1. You always work alone. 2. He will not help you. 3. If you hear a howl, run. 4. If you see him, it will already be too late. 5. Don't try to kill him. He does not die. A surge of fear shot through me. It felt as though the notebook had been deliberately left to scare off a newcomer. But by whom? And for what purpose? Perhaps it was just someone's silly joke or a local ghost story circulating among the rangers. And yet, I remembered Richard's mysterious question about what roams at night, and a bad, foreboding chill stirred within me. Could it be that these weren't merely tales? I tried to contact the base on the radio to ask Sam about the notebook, but the static on the channel drowned out any words. Cellular service was useless here. The signal kept cutting out. Feeling increasingly isolated, I decided to check my supplies, sort out my duties, and distract myself from the unsettling thoughts. Soon, I stepped out onto the open deck atop the tower. The wind swayed the trees, and the majestic beauty of the Appalachians unfolded in full splendor. If you listened only to the rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of animals, you might believe you had merged with the wild. But a glance at the notebook shattered that tranquility. The words about an invulnerable creature, a nocturnal howl, and the futility of weapons seeped into my subconscious. I understood that I couldn't run away immediately. I had just arrived, and my shift was about to begin. My rational mind urged me not to panic, yet my heart pounded and my hands trembled uncontrollably. I was convinced that something lurked in these mountains and I would have to uncover its secret. But first, I had to learn to live with the thought of these 5 rules, which might very well save my life. The first few days in the tower passed routinely as I performed all my assigned duties, checking trails, monitoring potential campfires, and keeping weather reports. Everything seemed almost normal. Tourists occasionally passed by, staring in surprise at the guard tower, but nothing else seemed amiss. When I contacted the central station, I mostly spoke with the on-duty operator, who kept me informed of current events. I no longer saw Sam or Jessica. It seemed as if the entire staff had been scattered to different sectors. Then, one of the reports mentioned a missing tourist. It was reported that a man hadn't returned from an overnight stay, and his friends had raised the alarm. I was tasked with inspecting a nearby trail that led to a creek. Packing my backpack, I set off, trying to dispel the unsettling thoughts. The forest greeted me with damp grass and the rustle of leaves, while a gentle breeze brought the sense of fresh pine and wet earth. In those moments, I forgot about the ominous warnings from the notebook and savored the natural harmony. But that feeling didn't last long. When I reached the trail, everything appeared normal, except that, on the roadside, lay a backpack, as if someone had abandoned it in haste. I examined its contents, a supply of food, a water bottle, and a local map. A thought flashed through my mind. Perhaps the tourist had lost his way and left the bag behind to lighten his load. But why hadn't he taken the water and map? I found no answer and continued on, examining the ground and the shrubs more carefully. More than an hour passed without any sign of the missing person. I then decided to check the area around the creek, since there was always a possibility he had gone for water and couldn't return. Descending along the trail, I felt the air grow damper and colder. Mud squelched underfoot, and the distant sound of rushing water was unexpectedly loud. Perhaps recent rains had given the stream extra force. And then I heard something resembling a howl. It was a sharp, piercing sound that sent shivers down my spine. At first, I thought it was just an ordinary wolf or coyote. But the howl was too deep, almost human. My heart began to race as I recalled the notebook's words. If you hear a howl, run. But run where? I stood by the creek with no one around for miles. I couldn't abandon the search for the tourist, especially since I wasn't even sure what was making that sound. Struggling to overcome my fear, I returned to the main trail and headed back to the tower. All along, I listened intently to every rustle, even as I tried to convince myself it was just a wild animal. Yet the feeling that I was being followed persisted. When I finally reached the guard tower, a surge of relief washed over me, as if I'd just escaped an unseen danger. And then I remembered, if you hear a howl, run. I ran, but what if by doing so I only confirmed my vulnerability? That night I couldn't force myself to sleep. The paralyzing, hypnotic howl replayed in my mind over and over. I now understood that the warnings in the notebook weren't just a joke. Somewhere nearby, something prowled. A creature likely capable of imposing its will in this forest, and it seemed that one person alone couldn't stand against it. But I still had to fully grasp just how serious it was. My first ominous night shift began immediately after that eerie howl by the creek. During the day, I had focused on my usual tasks, checking trails, planning the next round, yet thoughts of the missing tourist lingered. The evening brought an overcast sky, and the forest plunged into darkness earlier than usual. I felt an unfamiliar silence gathering around the tower, as if nature itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the unknown. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, I lit a couple of kerosene lamps to illuminate the lower level of the tower. From the upper platform, I watched as thick fog flowed between the trees, creating fantastic patterns in the moonlight. At times, it seemed that fleeting silhouettes appeared in the shimmering light, but I dismissed them as tricks of an overactive imagination. Shortly afterward, I attempted to contact the central station again, but the radio stubbornly emitted only bursts of static. With no cell signal either, the sense of isolation grew heavier on my mind. I recalled the strange warnings in the old notebook, trying to convince myself they were merely ghost stories. Around midnight, a knock sounded from downstairs. At first, I assumed it was a fallen branch, but the knocking repeated, louder and more insistent. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously peered out the window. Down below, I saw a large silhouette standing on its hind legs, too tall and gaunt to be a wolf. My heart skipped a beat, and cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I immediately remembered the notebook's words, "If you hear a howl, run." But now there was nowhere to run, so I locked the door, fully aware that the thin wooden boards would hardly hold back something so powerful. Then I heard scratching in the silence, as if something was trying to climb up. I frantically grabbed my service rifle, recalling the final rule: don't try to kill him, he does not die. But what else could I do? The sounds continued for a while, sometimes quieting, sometimes emanating from the other side of the tower. When I looked out again, I saw a pair of glowing eyes fixed directly on me from the darkness. A chill ran down my spine, and I recoiled, trying to hide from that unblinking stare. Then came absolute silence. Minutes felt like an eternity. I sat there, with the rifle in my hands as if it could protect me from a creature that was impossible to kill. Fear choked me, and I cursed my own helplessness. The radio was silent, and my phone was just a useless piece of metal with no signal. The monster had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, but it was clear it hadn't gone for good, merely lurking somewhere in the dark. I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night, flinching at every sound. By dawn, I was utterly exhausted, yet I was afraid to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, those burning eyes and that long, upright figure in the moonlight reappeared in my mind. Every rule now resonated with a grim truth. I realized that from now on, every sunset could mark the beginning of another cycle of terror, and I was utterly alone in this wild thicket, with no one coming to help. When dawn finally broke, I managed to pry my eyes open. My night had been filled with dreadful tension, and I'd barely slept. Storm clouds gathered over the forest, and soon a torrential downpour began. Large raindrops drummed loudly on the tower's walls. I walked around the building, checked the radio again, but it only emitted distorted static. It was clear that I couldn't count on any backup. All I could do was ride out the storm and reach the central station as soon as possible. However, the plan quickly unraveled. In the middle of the day, as rain poured down in buckets, I noticed a figure approaching the tower through the window. My heart skipped a beat. No one wanders out in such a downpour and cold wind without reason. Squinting, I recognized Jessica with difficulty, soaked to the skin, her hair disheveled and a tired expression on her face. It seemed as though she had deliberately come for help. Through the clamor of the rain, I could barely make out her movements in the mud as she glanced around. As if in response to my inner doubts, the first rule from the notebook flashed through my mind. You always work alone. I remembered that Sam had said the same, that rangers at the station never work in pairs. Jessica's appearance didn't fit these strange regulations, yet I felt I couldn't simply ignore her call. She was slapping her hand against the tower wall to signal her presence. My heart pounded as I descended. Through a narrow gap in the door, I saw that she was pale and seemed to shiver from the cold. But something about her looked off. Her gaze wandered and the brief smile on her face was oddly misplaced. I tried to ask how she had gotten there, but the heavy noise of the rain and the lack of communication with the base left me with no clear answer. Then Jessica began making gestures, as if to say I needed to come outside. She pointed insistently toward a part of the forest, trying to persuade me to leave the tower. But a battle raged within me. I remembered what I had read in the notebook while also seeing before me someone I thought I knew. As I hesitated, the downpour lashed the roof with such force that the wooden walls creaked. A thought pierced me. If that terrifying entity could prowl at night in the form of an animal, what was to say it couldn't assume a human guise? Just yesterday I'd heard something inhuman, and now here was Jessica in a forest where she should be taking shelter from the storm. My mind screamed that all of this was suspicious. I recalled the second rule: he will not help you. It occurred to me that this warning might apply to anyone coming into contact with this forest, that the creature might be capable of impersonating someone familiar. I decided not to go out to her. If she really was Jessica, she'd come to explain herself after the storm. If not, then I was simply saving my own life. For several minutes I stood by the door, pressed against it, while outside I heard a desperate knocking. She, or it, was pleading increasingly to be let in, but I did not give in. Then suddenly the knocking stopped, a brief silence, followed by a gruff roar. Nothing like any human sound. I recoiled from the door, and in that moment, everything inside me stopped. I realized I had come face to face with that very entity, and now it was openly trying to lure me in by using Jessica's appearance. My heart was pounding so fiercely that it felt as though its beat echoed throughout the entire tower. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, Jessica was nowhere to be seen. Only the rain lashed the dirt road, and thick clouds gathered over the forest, plunging it into a gloomy twilight haze. I could almost physically sense the presence of something eerie, lurking at the edge of visibility. Realizing that the tower no longer offered me complete refuge, I decided to climb up and take a defensive position, even though I remembered the rule: don't try to kill him. I still grabbed my rifle and loaded it, reasoning that while it might work on ordinary creatures, if nothing else, it would at least give me a chance to retreat. I felt a terrible contradiction. The notebook insisted that the creature couldn't be killed, yet my survival instinct screamed that without a fight, I was doomed. Before I could secure my position on the observation deck, I heard muffled sounds behind me, as if someone were scrambling up the lower steps in the pouring rain. The shock nearly paralyzed me, but I forced myself to peer over the railing. What I saw was hardly human. A figure wrapped in sodden fabric, through which the outline of a strangely curved back could be discerned. Suddenly, it lifted its head, discarding its hood, or whatever served in its place. In the moonlight, I saw its snout elongate, transforming its human features into those of a wolf. I fired a quick warning shot. The echo reverberated through the forest, momentarily drowning out the sound of the downpour. The figure staggered and fell to its knees, only to rise again within seconds. I could almost feel its fierce, snarling gaze on me, even though its face remained partly shrouded in shadow. It became clear that a normal bullet meant almost nothing to it. The creature then lunged suddenly, seizing the platform's railing, which immediately creaked under its claws. I had no choice but to fight back, hoping that injuring it even slightly might buy me some time. I fired again, aiming at its shoulder, and saw it recoil, emitting a sound that was a cross between a howl and a human scream. But it wasn't going to fall. Instead, it dashed down the stairs, disappearing into the rain. That's when I realized that while the ammunition might not be lethal, it could at least scare the enemy off. Hastily, I gathered what I could: some provisions, my radio, a flashlight, and the remaining rounds. Outside, the rain continued to pour. I knew that my chances of escape were slim, but if I stayed, the creature would return. The tower had become a deadly trap. Struggling to stifle my trembling, I descended to the first floor, groping along the wall for any movement outside the door. Then, with a sudden burst, I flung the door open and bolted into the dark forest. Cold water splashed into my eyes. My pants were soaked through, and my boots slipped on the muddy clay. Still, I pressed forward, cursing with every step while scanning my surroundings. I knew that the werewolf was close. One bullet wouldn't be enough. I had to at least reach the old forest road and try to get to the central station or find any radio tower to call for help. Yet when I looked back, I saw a wolf-like silhouette flickering between the trees, moving on two legs. It became painfully clear. What had started as an escape was now a fight. I was faced with a grim choice: either confront it or be reduced to a pile of bones here in the pouring rain. There was no help coming. The forest around me rustled with the sound of swaying branches, as if spurring the creature on. The fourth rule from that cursed notebook echoed in my mind: if you see him, it's already too late. I had seen him more than once. Perhaps this was my fatal mistake. After a brief but desperate chase, I managed to break away from my pursuer for a short while. I found an overgrown side trail and, trying not to leave any traces, plunged into a thicket where sparse junipers mingled with massive oaks. My heart pounded, and my breathing became ragged from sheer exhaustion. My legs wobbled, soaked to the bone, but I knew I couldn't stop. Eventually, I reached a tiny shelter beneath an old fallen tree. I sat down, leaned against the damp bark, and closed my eyes. The downpour gradually subsided, with only a few droplets falling from the branches. The murmur of the forest softened into the familiar whisper of the night, punctuated occasionally by distant rumbles of thunder. Rummaging through my pockets, I found a small bunch of keys, a map, and a flashlight. The memory of a hiker's abandoned backpack flickered in my mind. I couldn't shake the thought that the missing person might have encountered the same horror I now faced. Sitting in that makeshift refuge, I finally gathered my thoughts. I recalled the notebook and its ominous rules, and I felt a burning need to understand where those cryptic writings came from. In the intense stress of recent days, I'd barely noticed that the tower still held old files and papyrus records from previous rangers. Perhaps there was some explanation hidden there, and if I was to return to the tower alive, I vowed to study every page of those archives. But fate had other plans. Early the next morning, barely able to move my aching legs, I stepped onto a narrow trail and discovered a half-ruined shack that seemed to have once served as a hunting guard post or an abandoned ranger's cabin. Deciding it was a better shelter than the open forest, I went inside and immediately stumbled upon a disheveled stack of papers. On top was a cover emblazoned with the Forest Service's logo, and a name that had been crossed out. I picked up several sheets and realized I was holding the diary entries of a former ranger. As I studied the pages, I came across mentions of mysterious disappearances. People vanished at night, and a strange howl was heard echoing through the forest. The records claim that no one who saw the entity survived unscathed. The former ranger referenced ancient legends of Native American tribes who had lived here long before the national park existed. According to these tales, deep within the woods dwells an ancient spirit capable of transforming into a wolf to punish anyone who disturbs the land's peace. It is immortal, feeding on the fear and blood of its victims. It became chillingly clear that the legend might be true, and that the one pursuing me was the result of that very curse. Perhaps for years, some rangers and locals had tried to fight it, albeit unsuccessfully. The entries also mentioned that ordinary bullets were ineffective and that neither silver nor folkloric rituals really worked, for the entity was not a werewolf in the classic sense, but something much older, bound to the forest. Absorbing all this, I sat in the abandoned cabin and felt the fear slowly give way to a sober realization. Now I knew exactly what I was up against. This creature didn't just kill, it guarded its territory and hunted anyone who dared intrude. And since I had already violated its domain, leaving would be no easy feat. A relentless thought hammered in my mind. You can't handle it on your own. According to the records, no one had ever succeeded. I had to save my own skin. Either escape the forest or, if necessary, face it head-on. Deciding not to remain in one place any longer, I waited until dawn finally dispersed the night's gloom. The downpour had left the forest floor muddy and treacherous. I left the cabin with a clear plan. During the day, the creature would likely be less active, giving me a chance to reach the central station, somewhere closer to civilization and radio signals. There I could report what had happened and call for help, if such help even existed. Relying on the rough map I kept in memory, I headed north toward what I believed was the main road. An eerie silence accompanied me, so complete that not even birds broke it, as if the forest itself had fallen into a stupor. Occasionally, I heard the distant creak of branches, but I couldn't tell who or what was moving deep within the thicket. With each passing hour, the journey grew harder. Mud clung to my boots, the slopes were treacherous, and I was overcome by a dreadful weakness from the night's ordeal. Eventually, I paused to catch my breath and then caught the faint sound of a wolf's howl off to the side. It echoed from far behind me, and a cold sweat ran down my spine, meaning it was still tracking my trail. I quickened my pace, determined not to lose vigilance or stumble into one of the many crevices that scar the Appalachian terrain. Later that evening, I emerged onto an old country road beneath which flowed a small river, a sound that, in that oppressive silence, was a welcome relief. I hoped that by following the creek I might eventually find a wider stream and with it a road leading to Asheville. But as the sun sank lower behind the mountains, I realized that when darkness fell, the creature would truly come alive. My fears were confirmed when the sky abruptly darkened under a mass of rolling clouds. Raindrops began to rustle through the leaves once more, and on the opposite bank of the river, I noticed movement. Looking closer, I saw a wolf-like silhouette gliding between the tree trunks. It seemed as if it had resigned itself to being seen and no longer bothered to hide openly. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands grew cold. I quickened my pace, trying to stay as far away from the riverbank as possible, for if the creature decided to swim across, I'd have too little time to react. but as I rounded a bend along the river's course, reddish glints of eyes appeared from behind the bushes again. It was as if the werewolf was playing a twisted game of cat and mouse, allowing me to cling to a faint hope of salvation. As twilight deepened, I was practically running, stumbling over stones and tangled roots. Behind me, a howl boomed, deafening and monstrous, as if the entire forest were echoing that unearthly cry. Running further was dangerous, yet stopping was unthinkable. I gasped for breath, feeling a burning in my lungs. My muscles ached, and my mind grew foggy. Then I resolved to press on. If I didn't reach the station before nightfall, I might never escape. The creature I knew understood this all too well. It accelerated, appearing alternately on my left and right, sapping my will with every step. It seemed that any moment now, it would clamp its jaws around my neck. Yet my will to live pushed me forward. I couldn't recall the last time I felt such a mix of despair and fury. It was my final chance. Either break into the light or be trapped in this dismal forest forever. I decided it was time to summon every ounce of strength to break through. In the dying light of day, I noticed that the forest was thinning, which gave me a spark of courage. Perhaps the station, or at least some road, was near. Adrenaline surged through my veins, drowning out any sense of fatigue or hunger. But the creature was relentless. When I, in my desperation, turned onto a wider trail, its silhouette materialized directly ahead, just a few dozen yards away. It stood tall, still bearing distorted human features. I froze, uncertain of which way to run. Then, unexpectedly, Sam burst out from a side trail. His face was pale and determined. I didn't hear him utter a word. It seemed he understood that wasting time was pointless, but his gestures made it clear he was trying to distract the beast and give me an opening. I realized then that I had made a mistake. My earlier encounters with Sam had led me to think he was withholding something, that he knew more than he was telling. Now it was clear. He did indeed know more about this horror than he'd let on, yet he had chosen to help me survive, whether out of guilt or pure human solidarity. In an instant, the creature shifted its focus to Sam as he lunged toward it, waving his flashlight to draw its attention. I saw it lower its head as if sniffing a new victim, and then it growled. My heart clenched. I knew Sam stood no chance against this beast, an ordinary man even if armed. But my concern for him battled with my own instinct for survival. I knew that if I stayed, we would both perish. Sam, seemingly aware of this all too well, simply motioned for me to run. And so I ran, torn by guilt yet resigned to the inevitable, knowing that in this forest one person can do nothing against such an entity, and even two might be no better off. Behind me I heard the ferocious roar of battle and the clamor of a struggle. I didn't dare look back, knowing that doing so might completely shatter my resolve. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I staggered onward. A relentless thought pounded in my mind. Sam had sacrificed himself so I could escape. My previous carelessness had cost him his life. I cursed myself, the forest, and that strange creature lurking in its darkness. Yet I also knew that if I survived, I could warn others, perhaps even organize a rescue for those still missing. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged onto a clearing and saw approaching lights. It turned out to be a small patrol station where two rangers immediately noticed me. Seeing my tattered clothes, scratched arms, and the panic in my eyes, they understood that things were dire. I could barely speak, only managing to stammer that there was a monster in the forest and that Sam was dead. They might have dismissed my words as the ramblings of a terrified man, but when they saw my blood-stained rifle, they realized the situation was far more serious. In the following weeks, I slowly regained my strength in a small hospital at the central station. The doctor said I was deeply depleted and in shock, and my psychological state left much to be desired. I barely spoke, only occasionally recalling Sam's sacrifice and how he gave me the chance to escape. The higher-ups treated my story with skepticism, but the evidence, missing people, torn clothing, traces at the tower, and defensive gunfire spoke for itself. Richard, who had once struck me as a bit odd, now appeared genuinely concerned. He simply asked if I was sure of what I had seen. I nodded silently, and no further questions were asked. Perhaps the park's management had long been aware of the forest's horror. Yet they preferred silence to avoid panic or scaring off tourists. Maybe they understood, too, that fighting this ancient terror was futile. After several weeks, I began to recover enough to be allowed to leave. The world around me seemed unchanged, yet I could no longer gaze upon forests and mountains without shuddering. Remembering Sam's selfless sacrifice, I resolved never to return to that cursed territory. I gathered my belongings and headed to Chris's place, hoping to rest and piece myself back together. But as soon as I crossed the state line, I felt acutely that a part of me had remained in those woods. The horror of meeting that indestructible entity weighed heavily on my soul. Nightmares, filled with flickering eyes and piercing howls, haunted me. I blamed myself for Sam's death. Anger and pain overwhelmed me. And the most terrifying thought was that people would continue to vanish if the park wasn't closed, or if no one found a way to drive out that monster. Nonetheless, the Forest Service continued to operate as if nothing had happened. Every week, new personnel arrived, and as I learned from unofficial sources, the higher-ups never conducted any thorough investigation. Everything was written off as a mere accident or a possible attack by a large wolf. I knew deep down that the truth was buried much further. This forest has its own laws, and it never releases those who have seen its dark side. The final scene still vividly haunts me. Shortly before my departure, I saw a young newcomer arriving at that very guard tower. He walked in confidently, inspecting the place with a joyful curiosity, just as I once had. At some point, he will likely stumble upon that very notebook with the 5 rules written in bold black letters. Most likely, he'll read them with a smile, thinking, "That will never happen to me." But the forest remains a forest, and those who wander its depths never truly die. Story 2. I still remember the day when we loaded our backpacks and weapons into my old Jeep Cherokee. Jake and I had been planning this trip for several months. We wanted to experience true freedom one last time before the routines of college life sucked us in. Sam joined without hesitation, though he warned that the Appalachian Mountains could throw some unpleasant surprises our way. Evan, on the other hand, was carefree. He viewed the trip more as an opportunity for a picnic with a touch of extreme adventure. I watched him, keeping in mind all the stories of people disappearing in these woods. But we were young and eager for adventure. We met at my house on the outskirts of a small town in West Virginia. While I was checking my hunting rifle, Jake was cleaning his double-barrel shotgun. Sam, a descendant of Native Americans, presented us with an unexpected gift. A set of hunting knives engraved with intricate patterns, saying they were imbued with the spirit of our ancestors. I didn't put much stock in such mysticism, but I could tell it was important to him. Evan smirked, as if all these rituals were just part of a fun game. We set off early in the morning. The road wound like a serpent through mountain gorges with dense tree canopies sometimes obscuring the sky. The surroundings were quiet. Only the chirping of cicadas and the occasional passing car reminded us of civilization. Finally, we turned onto a country road and I felt a shiver in my chest. The old Jeep jolted over the bumps while the dark depths of the wild forest unfolded before us. The dense trees merged into a solid wall, and somewhere in the distance, the outlines of mountain ridges could be seen. We arrived at the spot where we planned to leave the car and got out to look around. The air was heavy and humid. It felt as if the forest were breathing down our necks, every creak of a branch filling me with vague unease. While Jake stretched his legs, Sam surveyed the area and noticed a barely visible trail leading deeper into the woods. Evan, jokingly, went ahead with an emphatic gesture inviting us to follow. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and trailed behind them, determined not to miss a single detail of the world around us. At that time, I had no idea how dangerous this place would turn out to be. We thought we were embarking on another thrilling hike, complete with campfires, a starlit sky, and a bit of hunting. But deep down I felt a strange premonition, as if the forest itself were calling us, whispering its dark secrets while simultaneously luring us into a trap from which escape would not be easy. We delved so deeply into the forest that the roar of engines and the smell of asphalt became a distant memory. By evening, we found a suitable clearing surrounded by tall pines and maples. The sun was setting, its golden glow filtering through the leaves and falling upon our tents and backpacks. I helped Sam stretch the tarp to secure our camp against any possible rain, while Jake gathered kindling and built a fire. Evan, with a show of enthusiasm, checked the provisions, doing his best to act as if he wasn't at all afraid of a night in the wild. When darkness fell, the campfire's flame was our only source of light. I sat leaning against a boulder listening to the forest's silence, which was occasionally broken by the crackle of snapping twigs and the rustle of grass. We dined on dried meat and beans from canned food, and after such a long journey, the meal tasted especially good. I couldn't help noticing that Sam kept glancing at us with a distinct look of worry, though no one dared to broach any serious topics. It felt as though everyone sensed something strange, yet we all tried to ignore it. That night I took the watch. I had always loved stargazing, especially far from city lights. But that night I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us from the darkness. At one point, I noticed a pair of greenish lights among the trees. At first I thought they were merely the reflective eyes of a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal, but they were positioned higher than one would expect and shimmered oddly, as if glowing from within. I squinted, and for a brief moment I could just make out a silhouette. It was tall and slender, with disproportionately long arms. I immediately raised my rifle, yet saw nothing more than swaying tree trunks. I nearly woke my friends, but decided I was simply exhausted from the day. Perhaps my imagination was playing a cruel trick on me. I stepped a few paces further into the forest, trying to peer through the thick ferns, when a chill of terror suddenly gripped me. There wasn't a sound to be heard, as if the entire forest had fallen silent in anticipation. I turned back to the fire and roused Jake to take over my watch. He merely yawned and shrugged, and I lay down, my heart pounding faster than usual. Just before drifting off, I caught a glimpse of Sam, his eyes open and fixed on the darkness with the same tense look, as if he too had sensed something. Morning greeted us with cool, damp air and a dense fog. Sam was the first to wake. He quietly surveyed our surroundings, checking for any signs of unfamiliar tracks. When Jake, Evan, and I emerged from our tents, Sam looked troubled. He pulled me aside and, in a hushed tone, recounted the legends passed down in his family, tales of creatures that roam the night forests, luring unwary travelers and feeding on their flesh. He called them wendigo, describing an ancient force that awakens when people let their guard down. I listened with skepticism, but the memory of those green lights in the dark lingered in my mind. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a ghost story, yet another part recognized that the forest was capable of birthing nightmares that defied all logic. As we ate our dry cereal and instant coffee for breakfast, muffled sounds drifted in from the distance, resembling a far-off howl that morphed into a prolonged, eerie wail. I glanced at Sam, who tensed and then nodded toward the south. He said we needed to head for the river where we could set up camp more safely and, if necessary, reach civilization more quickly. Jake suggested that we keep our weapons at the ready. He gripped his double-barrel shotgun as if expecting an attack at any moment. Evan waved off the concern, insisting it was probably just coyotes or stray dogs, though I noticed his hand tightening nervously on his backpack strap. We pressed on straight through dense thickets, guided by the compass and map Sam clutched tightly. The path grew ever more treacherous. Tree roots rose above the ground, causing us to stumble, and sharp branches snagged our clothes. At one point, we heard another chilling cry, this one closer and resembling a distorted human scream, as if ripped from someone else's throat. A surge of anxiety boiled within me. Jake gritted his teeth and quickened his pace while Sam kept a vigilant watch. Even as Evan tried to crack jokes, his laughter came out nervously. Then, in the distance, we caught sight of a vague silhouette between the trees. We froze. The creature stood atop a small boulder staring directly at us. I couldn't make out its features clearly, but its gaze seemed to pierce right through me. As the silhouette vanished, I realized that our once carefree hike had turned into a perilous expedition. We had come face to face with something we would rather never know. We tried to stick together, but fear propelled us forward in a frantic dash. Sam insisted it was vital to reach the river and cross over, claiming that wendigo despise water. His words sounded like something out of ancient myth, yet I couldn't deny that the silhouette we had seen was unlike any ordinary predator. We zigzagged through the underbrush, desperate to cover as much ground as possible. With every step, I increasingly felt that something was following us. Before long, we stumbled upon an old suspension bridge strung across a deep ravine, with a raging stream roaring below. The bridge creaked with every slight movement. Some of its planks were rotten and the ropes were thick with green moss. I suggested testing its stability first, but Sam was adamant we had to move immediately before the wendigo could catch up. We began crossing the narrow, creaking planks with utmost caution. Beneath us, the river roared, leaving no chance of survival if we were to fall. Midway across, I heard a sharp crunch of branches behind me, followed by an unnatural scraping sound. I glanced over my shoulder, and in the distance made out a vague figure. A creature that seemed to stretch its neck and scrape the ground with long, spindly arms, exposing knotted bones. My heart pounded and adrenaline surged, pushing me forward. Jake glanced back, his shotgun at the ready, but he hesitated to fire. The distance was too great, and the bridge might not withstand the recoil. After we reached the far bank, we grabbed hold of the ropes to pull them down and render the bridge impassable. I helped Sam, and together we cut through the cords. The bridge collapsed with a resounding crash, dragging several planks into the ravine. I caught a glimpse of the creature on that side, frozen at the edge of the cliff. Its eyes glittered in the sunlight, and it bowed its head as if trying to comprehend what had just occurred, then emitted a low, guttural sound that sent shivers deep within me. Barely had the bridge fallen when an echoing wail resounded, and I felt a sharp relief mixed with terror. We moved further away from the ravine's edge, heading deeper into the forest. Glancing back, I saw the creature vanish among the trees. Perhaps we'd bought ourselves some time, but it wasn't certain we were safe. Sam explained that the wendigo would not give up easily and might seek alternate routes. We realized that with the bridge destroyed, there was no turning back. We were cut off from civilization in the heart of this dangerous wilderness. We eventually chose a dry rise where the tree branches spread apart, giving us a clear view in every direction. There, we set up camp and decided against making any major moves until morning. Around the perimeter, we rigged up makeshift signal traps fashioned from tin cans and empty shell casings, designed to clatter at the slightest movement and warn us of an intruder. Jake and Sam took the first watch shifts while I stood guard until dawn. The night was fraught with tension. Every rustle in the dark undergrowth seemed to carry an imminent threat. I couldn't sleep, even inside my tent, listening as Jake kept his shotgun close and Sam periodically added more kindling to the fire. At one point I dozed briefly, only to awaken with a profound sense of emptiness. It occurred to me that something was missing from the camp. I listened carefully and realized the familiar sounds of Evan's restless sleep, his sighs or murmurs, had ceased. I bolted out of the tent and called for Sam. He had noticed the same thing. We circled the camp and discovered that Evan's gear lay untouched, and he was nowhere to be seen. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, just his inexplicable disappearance. Jake paled as he inspected the surrounding bushes. It looked as though someone had carefully disabled one of our signal devices to keep it from clattering. Sam confidently declared that this was the work of the wendigo, explaining that the legend spoke of a creature capable of quietly stealing people away as silently as the darkness itself. We split up briefly to search the immediate area but found nothing. I watched as Sam examined the ground, studying the flattened leaves and broken twigs. He frowned. The tracks were smeared, as if someone had moved with inhuman speed or in an unnatural manner. Jake, distraught, blamed himself for not noticing sooner. And I felt a deep regret and guilt, knowing that we had all been aware of the looming danger yet had been unable to prevent it. At dawn, gathered around the dwindling embers of our fire, we tried to decide what to do next. Returning to the far bank was not an option. The bridge was gone, and we had no other way out. Besides, no one would believe that Evan could have simply run off. Sam confirmed that the wendigo hated fire and was afraid of silver, but insisted that we also needed sound judgment and a solid plan. I gritted my teeth as I stared at the dark silhouettes of the trees, feeling that this forest would not let us go until it claimed its next victim. We stayed put until noon, hoping against hope that Evan might return. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby, yet in peril. Sam suggested scouting the area to see if there were any useful trails or old hunting camps. He was convinced that even a creature with unearthly abilities couldn't hide all its tracks. He gathered some provisions, grabbed one of our engraved knives, and took a few rounds of ammo that we divided among ourselves. Despite his calm expression, I noticed Sam's eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. Before we set out, he quietly mentioned that the creature could mimic, copy human voices and even appearances. To prevent any misidentification, Sam devised a system of password questions and answers. If anyone returned to camp, we'd ask a control question and expect the correct answer. Jake and I memorized these combinations, careful not to mix them up. Then Sam slipped into the dense trees, and I watched his silhouette vanish among the branches. I decided we couldn't just sit idly by. Together with Jake, we rigged several additional tripwires and set up illuminating flares that could be ignited if necessary. The fog had lifted, but the heat had not arrived. Instead, the forest exuded an eerie coolness, as if it were regulating its own temperature. The silence was almost oppressive. Only occasionally did sounds resembling the rustle of wings or the crackle of twigs break through. The hours dragged by agonizingly slowly. I squinted into the undergrowth, straining to detect any movement. At times I thought I saw a fleeting figure of Evan, but it was merely a trick of the shadows among the ferns. Several times I believed I heard a soft, distant voice as if someone were calling my name, but I knew the wendigo was capable of mimicking human speech to lure its prey, so I forced myself to remain where I was. Sam returned at sunset. He entered our camp circle cautiously, loudly assuring us that he was a friend. Jake and I then asked our control questions, and Sam answered exactly as agreed. He looked tired and agitated as he reported that he had seen fresh tracks on a northern slope and heard strange sounds like a drumming or distant strikes of stone against wood. According to him, we needed to prepare for the night. The creature was drawing closer and appeared particularly active after dark. We resolved to leave the dangerous area at dawn and continue our journey, hoping to bypass the steep sections and reach gentler trails. But with many hours remaining until morning, darkness crept in faster than usual. I felt a rising anxiety, as if the forest were breathing down my neck, waiting for the perfect moment. Sam and Jake set up rudimentary perimeter traps, staking sharpened branches into the ground and fastening thin wire at their bases. Meanwhile, I arranged our fire pit so that we could quickly add fuel to maintain a high, steady flame, for Sam insisted that fire was the wendigo's greatest fear. Night fell swiftly. We huddled around the fire, weapons in hand, listening intently to the surrounding darkness. Suddenly, I heard a snap of twigs, and I raised my flashlight to peer into the gloom. I strained my ears and discerned muffled footsteps. Out of nowhere, a figure emerged from behind the trees. He wore no upper clothing. His body was marked with scratches and dirt, and his hair hung in tangled strands over his face. I recognized the unfortunate man as Evan, though he looked gaunt and scarcely resembled his former self. He took a few hesitant steps before collapsing to his knees, breathing heavily. We didn't rush to him immediately. Sam reminded us that the wendigo was known to assume human form. I was about to risk approaching him, but then I remembered our password system. Jake asked the control question that Evan was supposed to know. I waited with my heart pounding. At first, Evan was silent, then he began babbling incoherently, failing to utter the correct words. A surge of icy terror welled up inside me. The figure on the ground lifted his head, and I saw his distorted facial features begin to change. His eyes flared with a ghastly light, and the skin on his hands stretched, revealing bony fingers. His body straightened unnaturally, and before us stood a gaunt, yet eerily powerful silhouette. The creature's jaws elongated, emitting a creak reminiscent of tearing flesh. I realized with a sinking heart that this was the wendigo masquerading as our friend. It let out a long, ear-splitting shriek and lunged at us, closing the distance in a heartbeat. I raised my rifle while Sam lunged forward with his knife, and Jake scrambled for his shotgun. Clearly, the fight had begun. In the flickering light of the fire, I saw its snarl, its unnaturally long teeth, and the hollow darkness of its eyes. The creature moved with terrifying speed, as if no longer bound by human limitations. I tried to shoot, but the wendigo darted aside, and the bullet whizzed past. Jake fired his shotgun, grazing the creature tangentially. Sam, screaming, hurled a burning branch at it. The flames sparked, and for a moment caused the wendigo to recoil, emitting a sharp cry from its throat. as if the fire inflicted special pain. Realizing that we needed a more potent flame, I remembered the insect repellent spray I had stashed in my gear. I retrieved it, grabbed my lighter, and fashioned an improvised flamethrower. The small canister hissed as I pressed the valve, unleashing a stream of ignited gas directly onto the wendigo. It roared and lunged, attempting to dodge, but several bursts caught it, scorching its ashen skin. I heard a sickening crunch of bone or charred flesh. The creature convulsed, letting out an inhuman howl. Jake didn't waste any time. He pumped several more shells into the wendigo with his shotgun. We weren't sure if it would kill the beast, but every shot sent it into spasms. Sam managed to drive one of his knives straight into its chest, aiming for the heart, while I continued to drench it in flames. Soon, the air filled with an acrid smoke, a mix of burning flesh and char. The wendigo writhed, its bony arms flailing as if grasping at the air, before finally collapsing to the ground. Its body seemed to merge with the darkness, becoming a formless mass still shuddering in convulsions. We kept dousing it with fire until the creature fell silent. I could see charred remnants of skin, through which strange growths or horn-like plates, reminiscent of elements of armor, peeked through. When the movement finally ceased, we cautiously approached. The creature resembled nothing so much as a deformed carcass, a grotesque, unrecognizable remnant of what might once have been human. The sight was ghastly and unnatural. We stood there amid swirling smoke, shaken to the core, coming to grips with the fact that Evan, our friend, was most likely long dead. What lay before us embodied an ancient terror, and facing it had left us with a crushing sense of guilt and despair, for nothing could bring our friend back. After a brief discussion, we decided to leave immediately. The air here reeked of death and carried a heavy, sinister charge, as if the very spot where we had dispatched the wendigo had become the nucleus of an evil energy. My legs felt numb from exhaustion and stress. Jake said nothing, mechanically checking his weapon while staying close. Sam, withdrawn as ever, managed to retrieve the creature's heart. He wrapped it in coarse fabric without explanation, but I knew that in his tradition such an act was significant for the ultimate defeat of evil. We trudged on for hours, navigating by compass and the few markings on trees. I thanked my luck for my lifelong love of hiking and my ability to find my way. Finally, we emerged onto a sunlit country road. So utterly exhausted were we that we collapsed to our knees on the roadside, grateful for even a semblance of solid ground beneath our feet. After a while, a farmer in an old pickup truck drove by. He stopped, visibly troubled by our condition. We couldn't, and didn't want to, go into details, so we simply said we'd encountered serious trouble in the forest and were in need of help. The farmer frowned, but agreed to give us a ride to the nearest town without pressing further. Perhaps he knew the legends and understood that sometimes events in these parts are best left unsaid. Once in town, we rented rooms in a cheap motel on the outskirts. Locked inside, I felt, for the first time in days, a sense of relative safety. I washed soot and blood from my face, my hands trembling with each flash of memory. Sam kept watch at the window, checking to see if we were being followed, while Jake sat on the bed, staring blankly, as if too frightened to close his eyes and relive the nightmare of those mountains. The next morning, we took a taxi to where my Jeep was parked. It still stood there, dusted with leaves and dirt. We loaded our meager gear and headed back to town, trying desperately to forget the road that had plunged us into a living nightmare. Yet each of us knew that the memory of what had happened would haunt us for a long time. Once home, we barely saw each other for a while. Jake threw himself into work, trying to push the experience from his mind. I spent long hours in my room turning over the engraved hunting knife that Sam had given me and recalling how the forest darkness had whispered to us through the crackling of the campfire. Nightmares came frequently, visions of raging fire, charred wendigo limbs, and Evan's lifeless body, and I would wake up drenched in cold sweat, trapped by my own guilt. A few days later, Sam left for his reservation. He explained that he had to report what had happened to the elders and deliver the wendigo's heart for a ritualistic destruction. I didn't fully grasp all the intricacies of his culture, but the look in his eyes showed that this was a sacred duty. Before departing, he murmured that such creatures were rarely alone and that his people would soon launch a major hunt for any remaining wendigo still lurking in the Appalachians. Weeks later, I received a brief note from Sam in the mail, informing me that the ritual had been successful and that the others had been discovered and destroyed by a group of his tribesmen. I shuddered involuntarily, imagining the horrors they must have faced. Yet to my relief, Sam ended the note by assuring me that the danger had significantly diminished, and that, in his words, the spirit of evil would not easily be reborn. Soon after, Jake and I met in a small cafe and made an unspoken pact, never to speak of the wendigo, Evan's death, or what had happened in those woods. We knew no one would believe us, and the story was too monstrous to share. Time passed, and although the scars in our souls gradually began to heal, true peace never fully returned. At night, when I awoke from yet another nightmare, I thought about how any evil might one day awaken again. But the choice remained ours, to reveal the truth or keep it locked away. I didn't know then that years later, I would decide to break our silence and try to warn others. Deep down, I believed it was better to share the truth with people than to let the darkness of the mountain woods continue its reign.